I'm back. This is me. This is my show. I mean, the channel's got my name in it, so what else did you expect to show up on the screen? Normal is again out this week speaking at an AWS conference. So my co-host, we send you love. For those of you watching live, I'm excited about this episode because we're going to go through some of my tips. I'm actually going to be making some examples of these tips live. Some of this stuff I have written down. Some we're going to do as we go. I'm looking for any tips that you would share if someone put you on the spot and said, hey, any particular container tips. I mean, it doesn't have to be Docker specifically, just container tips. I'm going to focus specifically on Docker and Compose and maybe things over the last 4 years that if you learned Docker even 2, 3, 4 years ago, stuff's changed and the internet doesn't self-update. We all have to do our work. So ironically, there's people sometimes even at Docker's company that use old things or legacy stuff, and they don't realize it. I even saw and called it out at DockerCon last year on stage at a keynote that there was a line in a Compose file that was deprecated, and it happens. I mean, like, we all have history. We all have our habits. So I want to go through what I see with my students, what I see in the real world with my clients, what I'm seeing people struggling to learn or maybe making mistakes. And I also like to do Docker file, Compose file, and manifests. I like to do reviews. So I even have a form on my website somewhere that you can fill out for me to review your Docker file here on the show, which we haven't done that in a while. Every once in a while, not always, every once in a while I get asked, hey, could you do more Docker file reviews? I can only do them if people send me their Docker files. So, if you have one of those, show up and chat. I will, if I need to, I can go hunt down that form for sending me the link, because you can't put links in YouTube chat. I can, but you can't because I turned it off. Anyway, so let's just get started. Let's get into it. First, a couple announcements. Did you know that this show and its guests shows up in a podcast? And I say this every time. So if you've been here before, if you watched this beginning, you know these things. We are an audio podcast. These Q&A episodes don't tend to make it into these. So yay, you're showing up for a YouTube only version. And now on YouTube in the channel, you can go under podcasts and you'll see the live version, which is this. And you can, look at this giant list of almost 300 episodes. And then we have the edited version, which we're slowly, we're adding all future episodes of our guests. They're going to be showing up here in a more concise, edited down version. And then we're making clips from that. So you'll start to see, we're just playing the YouTube game. We're giving people what they want. So it's a little more work than we thought it was going to be. So it's taken us a while. And then a newsletter, which goes out usually every week, not every single week, but it's just things I'm releasing or content I'm creating. So it is zero fluff, in my opinion. Like, I don't do industry news. There's great other newsletters for that. I don't usually talk about the latest thing, but what I do talk about something when I do write on something long form, it's something I really care about, and I try to make it very useful and actionable. So jump on that newsletter. That's Bret.news. Find the links below in the description. And then you'll know who's going to be on the show, when the podcast's going to be released, what's going to be on the podcast, basically all that stuff. And then, this Discord server that we're all hanging out in above me, that's for chatting before and after the show. If we go down to the server, people are in the server chatting away. Yeah. You know how Discord works. It's the better version of Slack. All right. So any of you, I know a couple people were considering going to a DevOps Days in Washington, D.C. I'm on the East Coast of U.S. The nice thing is there's DevOps Days all over the world. So hopefully you can get to one. I'm thinking of going this one in September. I haven't officially paid for my tickets, but I think I'm going to be able to make it. So that's exciting. All right, let's get into this stuff. What do you want to hear about first? Let me bring up a list. By the way, hello everyone in chat. Alex is here. Inshun, sorry if I mispronounced that. Hello, what's up? Anton, Q. What's up, Martin? All right. The list I'm starting off with, I'm actually building the list. Oops, wrong button. That's the wrong button too. We're looking for VS Code machine, please. So a couple that I wanted to talk about, Docker Remote. A lot of you may know about these things if you've watched this channel, if you've tried to stay up on Docker releases, Docker Compose stuff. But I'm going to start building. It's a lot of this stuff is maybe tips that people didn't know from many years back, and they're still not commonplace, or tips because things are now changing in the last few years, and people have to change their behaviors, or there's a better way to do what you used to do. So I've got multi-platform. These are all topics I have. So remoting with SSH, what that means, different ways to deal with the context, multi-platform locally, switching to ChainGuard images, switching your builder to cloud builders. That's actually one I should probably put in here. Switch Docker to build in the cloud. I should say switch local Docker. I feel like that should be up here along with this Docker Remote, because the Docker Remote depends on, or this feature depends on Docker Remote. New features of Compose in the last few years, Dockerfile new features in the last few years, labels. This was not really a tip, but I guess it's maybe a tip on maybe how to think about Docker files, because this took me years to sort of understand the idea that everything in my Docker file is either runs or executes or has a meaning for when I build an image or when I run a container from it. And those are not very clear as to which things you do in a Docker file affect build versus runtime, and how there's some things that affect both and some that are exclusive. So I thought I need to make a graphic of this one. So if you are interested, we can go through that. Basically, I'm going to do what you tell me to do in chat. So I've got even more for this list. This is actually not a huge list, and I have probably 3 or 4 more that I'm going to pull up. So who's going to be the first one, either to give me a specific tip they're looking for, or if you're interested in any of these tips, you want me to go through demos and stuff. Ooh, thanks, Martin, for gifting a membership. Very nice. Thank you. Oh, look at that. Utkan. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. That is the first time I've ever had to say that name. That's a cool sounding name, Utkan, if I'm saying it correctly at all. But you were just gifted a membership from Unsecure. Look at you. Martin says, remoting with SSH. I'm actually personally hoping that we can actually not directly use a Docker daemon anymore in our company. Things like with registry auth keep causing issues. So I'm pretty convinced that having a transparent Docker socket proxy in between that fixes things like Docker default Docker registry auth is much better than even already awesome SSH proxying. Yeah, in fact, I could probably put here like for fancy auth, check out not Postgres. Portainer? Oh, look at it pre-filled it, and then this is AI at work. Portainer.io. Because I believe, right, the Portainer web interface provides a Docker engine auth option, or am I just thinking of registry? I might be confusing it. Someone's going to have to clarify, because I just had them on the show. You'd think I'd remember these things. Raul says, I find ChainGuard very interesting. I've been pushing to adopt those images instead of hardening ours. How difficult is it to move to ChainGuard? That's a good question. I think ChainGuard, if you stick with, let me see how I can say this. ChainGuard is easiest to switch to if you only use the package manager that came with your programming language or your programming framework. So for Node, that would be NPM, Ruby, gems. When you need a OS package manager, that's always the challenge, right? I think I made the rant last week. Let me make a rant. If you can avoid the OS package manager at all costs in building out your applications, it will be easier at every level. It'll be easier to develop. It'll be easier to test and build, and it'll be easier to deploy to production. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to save space, but if you can figure out a way to just use the package managers that are distribution agnostic, meaning it doesn't care whether you're on CentOS or Fedora or Ubuntu or Debian or Alpine, it just doesn't care because your package managers that you're using are language and ecosystem agnostic. Not the language agnostic. What am I saying? That they are distribution agnostic. I personally, over the years, I have switched my Docker image base from the default images, which are Debian, to making my own on Ubuntu, to trying to make Alpine work, then to switching back to Ubuntu, and then recently trying to start moving everything to ChainGuard. So, that's just me, and I've seen my clients change it too, because unlike physical OSs on servers, you don't have to go and boot from USB and then change out the OS and save the files and then reconfigure everything on the host, and that's for the hardware providers. That's why the cloud exists, so we don't have to worry about that unless we're running our own data centers, and you choose to make that your problem. The rest of us don't have to choose that. So that's the OS, and when we switched to containers, one of the wonderful things, one of the best chef's kiss choices that Docker made was you can bring everything with you. You want to install an apt package from Ubuntu 2004? Well, this is the base image for that. And then when you use apt as your package manager, everything will act the same as if you physically installed Ubuntu on your server. And that was great to bring legacy apps. But now we're 10 years into Docker. And I know some of us are still taking old apps and still Dockerizing them. And I get it. That's a struggle. But now that we've been here a while, I feel like the next step is to make your application Linux distribution agnostic. Let it be the people that run the data center. Let them decide the OSs that run on the hardware. In containers, I feel like the ultimate is for us to say, hey, as long as my language or my framework, I could be Golang, I could be Rust, I could be Ruby, Python, PHP, pick your framework, pick your language, and then everything else is based on that. And that you don't, the whole point of me answering this question this way is that ideally, when you switch from Dockerfile on default images of, let's say, Node to Alpine, and then from Alpine to ChainGuard, you didn't have to change anything but the first line, the from image. Because if you're using NPM, everything in your app should be able to stay the same, honestly. That's the goal to me. NPM's awesome. Gem files are great. These package managers, the only reason you would need the host package manager is if something is simply not provided in your language package manager. And what I've seen increasingly year after year after year is that for typical server workloads, typical today, meaning web services, batch jobs, things that are in your language, and rather than back in the day, we would bring together, and I consider this a little bit of legacy. Even I'm not going to pick on you too much, PHP people, but I've written a lot of PHP in my career and dealt with a lot of PHP apps, and them and Ruby and Python and languages that have lived for decades now. They have a challenge, and that is they tended to rely on the distribution or the OS package manager rather than doing everything again in their own package manager. And that made sense. But what the challenge is now is let's say you're in a PHP app. So now you need Node and you need PHP FPM and you need your Postgres driver, which maybe isn't installed with PHP. You have to go get it through apt or yum or APK or whatever your OS package manager is. And the minute that your language and your frameworks require you to go do that from the host OS, that's where a lot of the complexity and the problems and the security becomes an issue. There's so many different levels of complexity. The minute I instantly do that, I get an ick feeling in my Docker file. So if I go to my Docker file and I see in here, before I copy in my stuff, I set my work directory, and before I copy in my files, right, I see this thing where we have to go run apt install, something, whatever, -y git, right? Or some other tool. The minute that I see something like that in a Docker file, my goal is to change the behavior of the development team to stop thinking of that they can just install anything they want with any package manager without repercussions. That we have to have a really good talk around why Git is needed, rather than a library in your programming language. And maybe if you're on legacy programming languages, that's a decision for the next time you all want to start considering a framework or even a language change. That's why you start to see some of these newer languages that have a lot of these things as built into the programming package manager. So Node, Golang, Rust. Like, I see these languages where their attitude now is like, I don't want to have to use anyone else's package manager. I just want everything here. It doesn't mean that every single package will exist, but it may cause you to prefer one package over another. You're like, well, this package has great features, but I have to install this with the OS package manager. But this one comes with my NPM or my Go modules. I can get this natively, and I can avoid it. If you can do that, your life forever as a developer will be easier. You won't have to deal with distribution changes. You can quickly switch over to these chain guard 0 CVE images without a lot of repercussions, or any repercussions. It may just completely work. But the minute you depend on those OS Linux distribution package managers, you've already added another level of complexity. Even just this example of Git. We can talk about why you don't even need Git anymore down here with the new feature that Docker files have. And this is pretty recent. If you're using the syntax, which I talked about in my newsletter, Bret.news, in that newsletter, I talked last year about Docker file front ends, which is a significant new advancement in Docker over the last 4 years or so. And one of the things it allows you to do is keep adding new features to the Docker file without breaking old Docker files. And one of them recently is that if you use the add, remember, copy is really for copying in local files that are present wherever your Docker file is building from. So something in your repository. Add is for really, there is duplicate, there's overlap between these two commands. And you might have heard in the past, don't use add anymore. That's not entirely true. Just use add specifically when you know you need it. By default, you use copy for copying in local things. But if you need to get something remote from a remote server, you can use add. It has functionality to download and unzip things, untarball things, and as well as now it can clone Git repositories and then even automatically remove the .git directory. So this is great. I use this now whenever I need to maybe copy down a theme for Drupal or WordPress or Ghost or whatever. If I need to copy down some files that really just need to exist in the image, but there's no installation that needs to be done, this is my jam. Like, this is something that I would do when I need static assets and maybe they live somewhere outside of the repository. Maybe they're in a separate repository that I need to somehow get into this build environment with my programming repository. So I use that. You can even it even now supports building with private repositories using the Docker build option for SSH. So you don't copy in your keys or do any of that insecure stuff. You actually use it as a build argument when you're building. Actually, it's a part of the build command, and it will help you securely go get assets during the build without ever leaving any of that, any of the keys or anything that you would worry about. So that's just a random tip, by the way, but you want to get your Docker files simpler And this has influenced my consulting. When I go and work with companies, we try not to change any of the programming language, anything of their app to Dockerize it. But one of the things that I do try to pass on as advice is when you're making choices about frameworks, as a developer who's just focused on building features, building products, you need to start thinking about how adding different features and functionality is going to add to the complexity of your builds, your tests, and how it's going to affect deploying to production. I try to help developers not need to be operators. Like they should just focus on developing. But one of the good things that's come out of DevOps, yes, it does mean developers have to know more about how to deploy their software. But what it does create is a knowledge that helps them realize, oh, I maybe don't want to do that, adding this random thing or adding a apt package or a yum package, because that's going to add a bunch of complexity because I've had to deal with Docker files, production, changing from dev images to production quality images. And they see that added complexity. My favorite Docker files are the ones that are just npm install or, some other simple package manager, and it's a single command. Now, they might have to build static assets for websites. There might be an npm build or some other build command later for that. That's fine. But if they can avoid the OS package manager, it's going to be great. That's an excellent conversation. I need to put that into its own clip to talk about, let's get off the OS package managers for server applications. I get it. If you need to run a mail server or if you need to run a database, like these are all things that you can easily install with OS package managers. But I feel like as an industry, we need to move on from using the OS package managers to install the libraries we need for an app feature to work. I see that I used to see all the time for like processing PDFs or processing images, using external libraries that are probably built in C. And we would all just use the OS package manager because that's what we had back then. And I think really starting in the last about 20 years ago, we started to see these internet package managers really flourish that were language specific, that you could access over the internet without, with free open source. And we didn't always have that back in the day. Just catching up on chat after that long rant. Wow. Nancy Q's got 17 months. Conrad, Martin, what's up? What did you miss? I ranted for 10 minutes about avoiding OS package managers in Linux, especially when you're in containers. Like if you're building your own apps, avoid OS package managers. I feel like OS package managers are a pain. It prevents you from easily switching base images. They're an easy way to solve legacy problems, but I feel like everything you can do in your team to motivate the team to move away from those. I run into it all the time. And so I asked the team, what if we didn't have this as a method for installation? What would you do next? Would you need a new library? Is that library actually existing in your Go modules or your NPM packages or your Ruby gems? Some ecosystems in different languages have just this feeling of we're always going to use our package manager, even if it's redundant to the OS package manager. And I think that's a great attitude to have as a community, as a vibe, because OS package managers are great for some things, but not, I feel like, for making applications you're going to deploy on a bunch of servers yourself. I feel like we should just limit OS package managers to things that are their own services, MySQL databases, Postgres databases, SSH servers, mail servers. Like those are the things that I want to install with OS package managers, not some authentication library for LDAP in my application so it can support LDAP authentication. I don't want to use an OS package manager. I want to use my app built-in package manager for that. Yeah, I mean, the bad example in the Postgres, to me, it's like a call to action. Like I work with certain teams that like there's just no way we're going to get outside the OS package managers, but then I see other teams on more modern languages that never need to go to the OS package manager, and they're doing all the same stuff more or less. Like, so it feels like this is part of the culture of certain languages and frameworks, and I feel like that should be a decision factor for you all as you're doing more cloud native, as you're trying to build faster, go faster. These things should be considered, not just what's the coolest, trendiest language or what's the least lines of code in my language. Like sometimes it's hard to quantify all the parts of your, well, maybe we don't pick that language because no one in the team knows it. That's a reason to not choose one. But I feel like people aren't thinking bigger picture about sometimes when they're using frameworks and picking new stuff. How would you add in libpq if not apt-get? So yeah, I'm not a database driver. That's a great question. Maybe someone else knows, but you can use an already compiled version. Like, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I'm sitting here thinking like of all the teams I've worked with that work with databases, and I don't remember which database. I mean, everybody's working with multiple database stuff now, so it's like, and I know that I'm pretty sure every single one of them wasn't using install the Postgres library on the host. I just don't know exactly all their dependencies and their frameworks, their modules. So like it's a good question. I'll probably pay more attention to that now. Like, hey, how are you getting access to that stuff? So anyway, so no one really asked for this, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is kind of all, let's see. We've talked about Dockerfile front ends. I want to send this tip out. I don't think Eric's on today, but Eric Smalling made it a little list. This is, again, going back to my Docker tips. You should be putting in labels. I like using BuildKit, especially on GitHub Actions. I like using Docker's official build run or what. I don't know what it's called. I have to bring it up. Their action. It's called... no, that's not what I want. Where's the marketplace? I want the marketplace. Marketplace. Is it just marketplace? Yes. So if I go to actions and then Docker. So official ones, they're all with the blue check mark. So what we're talking about here, build and push. So I like using this because it adds a bunch of labels for me. But back here, there are more recommendations. So I'm going to put in Docker Captain Eric's recommendations back when he was working at Sneak. And I like using BuildKit because it already implements those best practices for me. Specifically, I'm not sure if it is true of using Docker build locally. I don't think it does the labels. You specifically have to add them, but they built this into the GitHub action. So if you're using this GitHub action, you can look up managing tags and labels. And one of the things, and so there's some stuff here that you can it talks about, but one of the things that helps with this when you're using this build action is to use the metadata action, which I believe is actually what creates the labels. So label. So yeah, so there's like stuff here about labels. And if you're wondering about all this and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of stuff about labels. I don't know all this stuff. That's okay. Just go to my account and I have a whole bunch of GitHub action recommendations specifically for the doc, even with the video. So I'm going to put this in chat. So you can go find my recommendations for how to use Docker's GitHub actions in your automation, and including adding all the functionality and turning on all the things like adding SBOMs to your build automatically, adding provenance It's all that stuff. All right. Back to the tips. So, yeah, build and push. Thank you, Nubuo. Yeah, Docker build. It's funny. There's so many of them now that it was easy for me to remember when it was like just a couple. But I feel like now Docker has. Okay, come on. They've got so many. They've got Scout 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 official Docker Docker actions. The Scout one's the latest one. Oh, actually, and well, Bake's been there a while. I'm excited about the future for Bake. We don't talk about Bake a lot because I was actually nervous about its future. Wasn't sure if Bake was going to get as much love and as expand on its functionality to make it worth everybody trying it out. But Bake is something that's been around Docker for, 6, 7 years maybe. And you just need to kind of read about it. It basically allows you to create more infrastructure as code around how you use the Docker commands, Docker build specifically. So do they have a tagline for it that just tells you? BuildX Bake. Yeah. What's the tagline? Bake is a feature of Docker BuildX that lets you define your build configuration using a declarative file as opposed to specifying a complex CLI expression. And I like that. I like that definition. I'm trying to get them. There we go. So yeah, check that out if you haven't tried Bake. I need to make a video on Bake. I just haven't seen a lot of people using it, and I think that's, at least in my case, I was kind of avoiding it because they launched it. It was a cool feature. We all were using it, and then Docker started killing features. Like they killed Docker app, and then they stopped talking about Bake or adding anything to it, and I thought, maybe I put this aside for a little bit. I don't want to tell everybody to start using it, and then suddenly the command goes away. But it seems like this year I've heard them specifically talk about it a few times, so that it gives me confidence that there's a future in Bake and that they want to make it better. We'll see. We'll see. Time will tell. All right. Do you want me to go through the SSH stuff and the content? All right, we'll do that. All right, so real quick, we've got to give you a quick background. I've got to give you a quick background on why you need to use SSH as your default way for just getting to remote machines. So in my scenario, I am on a Mac, and I build locally sometimes, but I also have home servers. So I have an Ubuntu VM in the closet that I run certain things on. I might run some containers for managing my HomeKit at home, my Apple HomeKit stuff, or running various things. I used to run VPNs on it. I think I use Tailscale now for everything, so I don't need the VPN anymore. But I do stuff on that little machine. I also have some servers on the internet that I tend to play with, and I just create those quickly. DigitalOcean, thank you, DigitalOcean. They provide me some free credits because I send out my free $100 coupon for DigitalOcean to anyone who asks, including you. Hey, you didn't ask, but I'm going to put it in chat anyway in case you want to try out DigitalOcean for some just easy cloud VMs for devs. Like, I wouldn't run a big old billion-dollar business on it or anything. But if you want $100 off, I use this. And what I end up just using the credits for is when you use that code to sign up, and if you ever end up paying for something, DigitalOcean gives me credits, and I spend all those credits making videos for you. Sometimes in my courses, but a lot of times for free here on the channel. So thank you for using my code to sign up because that helps me make the infrastructure. So here's a scenario. So I've got machines everywhere, and I don't want to have to SSH into machines and then run Docker things, because the things I get asked a lot are, Well, if I need files or I need utilities in these places that I'm running Docker, I don't want to have to install them. I don't want to have to mess with the machine. And quite frankly, I don't even want to have to SSH in because like my local terminal is all perfect. I use, you know, Powerline 10K, or I use Starship for managing my shell. I use my ZSH to make ZSH fancier. I have all this fancy stuff locally, and I don't want to put that on servers. So Docker has always really, I mean, I think since like version 1, they've had ability for you to remote in. Now, that original feature way back in the day was TCP TLS. Oh, sorry. Let me show you. TCP TLS. So you could turn on in settings. This is actually off by default, has been forever. Because there's no auth, you could ask Docker to listen on a TCP port, unencrypted and unauthenticated. And Docker has root in most cases by default. When you install Docker, it's root. So it was a rootkit. And, you know, way back in the day, 6-7 years ago, you know, those places on the internet, they announced that, oh, there's this major Docker, you know, oh, you can get in all these servers on the internet. Well, and people had to enable it. Like they literally had to turn it on and there's just, you know, they weren't paying attention. They didn't think there was a risk. So Docker then, you know, it always supported TLS, but then you had to manage your own certificates, and it still wasn't authentication in a sense of allowing multi-user. It just meant if you have this private key, you can get in. But then you had to share the private key with everyone. Everyone had the same key in your team, and it just sucked, right? So this long-term wasn't really an option. There was something called authz, which still works. You can add third-party functionality to authenticate to Docker. Those are all fine, but they're complex. There's layers to it. So I don't do that myself personally a lot. What I have always defaulted to ever since it was added 6-7 years ago, actually one of the core Docker maintainers, Akihiro, he added this functionality, and I celebrated it because it was a no-brainer. And it's a built-in feature that Docker will use SSH to tunnel in to any host you have an SSH key for. So I believe it only supports key support, doesn't support you having an SSH password. But if you have a key on that server and you can just SSH in directly, then you can, and that machine has Docker installed, it has to have Docker installed, then you can, in at least 3 ways, actually two main ways and then a third variant, you can get into that server by just sitting on your local machine, telling Docker a different context to connect to that machine, and it will do it over SSH. You'll never have to open up an extra port on TCP. You'll never have to worry about Docker authentication because SSH is handling the encryption, the tunneling, and the authentication for you. Okay, there's nothing inherently special about SSH and Docker. It's just you could have technically always done this maybe by setting up an SSH tunnel locally yourself and then running Docker through that, but that's a little more advanced, right? Certainly not as convenient. Maybe I only want my Docker commands to go over there, and I don't want all my commands to go over to that server. So the way that you can, there's 3 ways. We'll just go through these real quick, and I'll show you examples. Auth cert, yeah, wasn't TLS auth cert based? You can issue every developer their own cert. Yes, well, yes, you can technically do that. I have seen 0 people do that. And so you could technically have, like, if you have your own PKI infrastructure, you could issue those because they're PKI certs, right? Not SSH certs. So you could do that. The trick was always managing the certs on the server, I believe, unless you did, like, I don't even know if Docker even supported checking for revocation. Like, there was a lot to it. I never saw what I was hoping back 8 years ago was that people would add or companies would add authz support and extend all that functionality into some third parties so that Docker essentially would just go check some third party like OAuth or something. And it just never really happened because I think people moved on from single server Docker instances. I think Portainer would be the recommended solution I would give now, like universally. But for my own use and for small teams where they're just running single host, I mean, again, we're not talking, unless you're running Swarm, we're not talking about you running 100 servers with Docker on them. So that would be the case for Kubernetes. So Swarm suffers from, unfortunately, all this stuff too. So that's why OnSecure and I are having this conversation, is because if you're a Swarm fan, you have to deal with these limitations. But again, you might be able to use other tools on top of it. I'm just going to talk about the context real quick. But people don't maybe realize, so there's multiple ways. So we always had Docker host, right? So I could do this, right? Let me zoom in on that a little bit. So we have been able to put in there, since the dawn of Docker, TCP there. And that just means connect to that socket that's not normally listening, that we'd have to enable in the engine and then restart the Docker daemon, and we don't want to do that. But if we just change that with SSH, and assuming you have key support, that your key is in the authorized file for that user, you can do this, okay? That means this command, I can also hard code this environment variable. And I can do a one-off here, right? But this doesn't scale well, right? This only scales to like a compute, like 1. And technically, in my case, I have a machine inside my own SSH config file on my machine. We can look at that if you want, but this has nothing to do with Docker specifically. It's just if you add a machine into your .ssh/config file on your machine, then I could maybe do something like this, right? And that should work. And it's actually going to prompt me. You don't see it, but it's going to prompt me for my local SSH key, because I'm using 1Password to store my SSH keys. I love that. I love that feature. So the way we can know this worked is when I do that, my machine is ARM, and the server I just SSH'd into is AMD. It's an Intel chip. So in other words, my CLI is local, that engine is remote. And so that's easy. You can do that as a one-off. And if you needed it to be even easier, you don't want to have to put the user and the IP address or whatever, you can just store that in your .ssh config, right? That's the one-off. But if you want to go beyond that, and you're like, I manage 4 or 5 machines, that seems like a reasonable count. I manage 4 or 5 Docker machines. Maybe I have a swarm of dozens of machines, but I only need to manage the 3 hosts, the 3 manager nodes that I have. So I just want to have those 3 in my SSH config for easy use. Or I just want them in my Docker context. Well, there's this whole Docker context command. Docker context is the core command. Now, this works very similar to kube control config. So if you're used to that in Kubernetes stole that idea from Docker. I'm just saying. Docker did this here. And so we can do Docker context ls. On your machine, you will always have 1. You might even have these 2 default ones. The real difference here is I'm set up to point on my machine. This is kind of running under the screen here a little bit, but let me show you. So if I zoom out, actually, if I do that. Yeah, okay, perfect. So those are the 2 default on my machine. The top one basically means whatever I store in the host file is what it will do. And by default, if I don't have anything in the Docker host, it will use this. This would work on my machine as long as Docker desktop was installed as the root user or admin user on my machine. But in some corporate environments, you can't do that. And so when you install Docker desktop, it adds its own socket. This is a file socket that's on my machine. So it's only talking to my local Docker engine. But if I wanted to add one here, I could just do a Docker context add, or create rather. And you can even see, like, I've done in the past here, so it's creating those. So I'm just going to call it Docker remote. Actually, let's just do the help so you can see that. And then Docker context create, and I'm just going to tell it Docker remote. And this is going to be a machine I have over on the internet. So I could add that Ubuntu one, but it's more likely that you have a machine in AWS or somewhere else. So I have this Docker machine. I already have my SSH key on it because my cloud adds those in automatically. So I can just sit here back on this and do a Docker context create, Docker remote. And then I can just say description, DigitalOcean. And then when I do the -- Docker, that's basically what's the Docker connection to this engine, and the host equals SSH : // username at IP address, and then because my SSH key, I know you can't see all this, it's cutting off. I've created the remote now. So Docker context ls shows me the third one. Docker context use helps me switch directly, so I can do Docker remote. And now every Docker command I make on my local machine is going to go through that DigitalOcean server. So Docker version. Again, notice the server is on Intel chip, an AMD chip, and locally my CLI is on ARM. But this is a different one because we're going through that context. Now, if I did a Docker -- and this is a global option, context default Docker info, or version rather, I'm going to do version because it's shorter. That means for this command only, without using an environment variable, I'm changing the context for this command. And you can do this with any Docker command after you've created that context. Wait, context version. Okay, I've already done it. So I've done that wrong. Docker -- context default, and then Docker, the run or the info or the version or whatever. And then again, this is my local machine. So now you're going to see the ARM. So I'm pointing it back at my local machine. So the OS and architecture match on my local machine. Well, actually, the OS doesn't match because I'm using Docker Desktop. So technically, I'm running the CLI in Darwin, and I'm running the engine in my Linux VM locally. But if I take that out, so this makes it just, in my opinion, more convenient, right? Without having to manually switch. If I just need to do a couple of quick commands, like doing a stack deploy, right? I would just do the -- context. Nuno's here. What's up? So that's it on context. Let me make sure that I've got all that context stuff. So yeah, so we've talked about you can use Docker context or layers like the kube control config, that you can do it with a single command, either that way or with the environment variable if you just wanted to do that environment variable setting as well. By the way, when you change the context, it's stored in your local config, and you can go edit there, or you can copy that config over. Again, it's not going to store SSH keys or anything in there. This is purely using SSH in the background, so you've got to know how SSH works and where you store your keys, and you put your public key. By the way, just a random pro tip of life. If you didn't know how to get your friends' keys or your colleagues' keys so they can put it on the server, or if you can't find your own public key, just go over to github.com/your-username.keys. So if you know someone else's username.keys, this is a public URL, and it's basically just the public key. Again, it's not the private stuff. The public key that person uses to authenticate to GitHub. Often, that's the same key we use locally. That's the same one I use. I actually I encrypt it locally, so it's got a password or a passphrase or whatever you want to call it on my local key. I actually store mine in 1Password locally so that they're even more secure. They're not even stored on my local hard drive. They're only in RAM, and they're encrypted by 1Password. And then 1Password actually dynamically injects these keys locally that are matching this public cert. You can technically have a bunch here. You can add like 8 keys to your own GitHub profile. And when you do that, I think you might even be able to choose whether they're public. I can't remember or not. But there's a settings page in your GitHub, and you can have a bunch of keys here. I only have the one because I cleaned up a few years ago after having a bunch of different keys for different clients, different places, and I wanted them all here. I kind of simplified my life a little bit, updated, although this is an RSA key, so I don't know why I haven't updated. I thought I had a different key. So that might actually be an old key there. But yeah, do that. That's a pretty good setting. Now, last little pro tip on that is after you're doing that, if you dig this, if you want to mess with context more and you like to change it up, then you can use things like Starship, which is what I use, or Powerline or other tools to change your local shell, or even when you're in your code editor or in Vim, whatever, which is a code editor. You can use Starship or something like that, and we'll just show you what that looks like. If you go over to Starship, by the way, is a fantastic multi-OS shell prompt editor. Gosh, that's a horrible definition. I am not their best marketer. But yeah, Starship cross-shell prompt. So it's not technically a shell itself. It's just adding all this functionality in your shell, and you can see their demo. I use it for everything now. You can use it with npm package managers in your OS, package managers in your apps. It can also show kube control context, Docker context, stuff like that. So if you just go into their settings, you can set up Docker to tell you at every prompt which context you're pointing to. I personally turn it off until I need it, and then I change my Starship config to turn it on when I'm maybe managing a bunch of remote hosts. Maybe I'm building a bunch of new videos and I need a bunch of different machines, and which is actually something I'm working on now, like multi-OS, different architectures, stuff like that. So over in your shell, even though mine's simple, I could change my Starship config, and then I would see which context I'm using. It's basically, there's a command here, show. So like that Docker context show, you could write that into your own shell script for your own shell prompt. You don't even have to really use third-party tools. You would just basically have your prompt execute that command every single time, and it would spit that out, and you could parse that. I've done that in the past with my prompt and my PS1, but I just use Starship now. I can use Starship on all my machines. I just copy the config file over and I install Starship, and then boom, I'm done. It doesn't really matter which shell I'm using, which OS I'm using. It just all works. All right, let me check up on chat. If you have any more questions about that, the final thing there I'll say is that if you need something even more fancy for Docker, check out authz plugins. They're basically plugins for Docker. There might be a few out there. I'm not an expert on them, that will allow you to do third-party auth through Docker Engine directly, or check out Portainer, which can possibly do that for you as well. All right, catching up on the chat. Next time, a Swarm about Swarmgate, our Swarmgate project. Okay. Yeah, Martin, we need to. We'll talk about Swarmgate. Swarmgate sounds like Watergate, the whole gate thing. Swarmgate sounds like it's the drama of Swarm. Swarmgate sounds like back when Swarm and Kubernetes were all in combat or whatever. So I tend to. Yeah, Conrad uses 1Password for SSH keys. Quick tip for temporary environments: use SSH connectivity. Add this to SSH config on the guest, not the server. Host, strict host key checking. No. Right. That's a good tip. I'm going to have to throw that in there. Because I'm pretty sure my config, let me just check. All the way at the bottom. Yeah, see, I do it for host star. So we're all talking about SSH config. This is like going down a rabbit hole. But why not? Why not? Let's go down that rabbit hole. So I have a very long config file, but it's actually not that long. It's only 80 lines. Anyway, so host everything means for all hosts by default. If I don't have other custom SSH config settings, do these by default. And strict host key checking is no. Just like you said, because I don't want to be bugged every single time. I create cloud instances all the time. I do not want to have to put those in my key and then or in my my list, and then I don't want to have conflicts because an IP change. It just it's obviously less secure, but I'm not working for the government, so I don't have to worry so much about that. This other stuff, I like my root user to be default, so I don't always have to specify it. Other stuff. And then, identity agent, 1Password. That's how 1Password can inject those keys. 1Password's great. It'll tell you how to set it all up. The minute they came out in beta, I've used it ever since, and have had very little to no issues with it. So, Yeah, you're using Spaceship, which does something similar and works with Oh My ZSH. Yeah, cool. Thanks for the tip, Conrad. James, curious if I became interested in the Rust language. How is Rust for cloud language? I don't. I am not the best expert on that, but my understanding is that right now, in terms of the ecosystem, the languages are the same. Like, okay, I should say Go versus Rust. Let's talk about the latest modern languages that I hear the most. Go and Rust. My understanding is that Go has a bigger ecosystem for web frameworks, web hosts, web apps, stuff like that. And it's not that you can't do that with Rust. Both these languages can do a lot of the same stuff: local CLIs, local libraries, remote hosts, network computing. But I'm not saying Rust is not the best at what you want to do, but I think Rust is perfectly fine. If you know Rust and you want to run websites with it, great. I've just never done that specifically with Rust. So I would tend to go to Golang for that. But that doesn't mean you can't. It just is a question of what you know, and I happen to know Go a lot more than Rust. So I am not the one to answer that question. In fact, let's just say right now, I don't really know Rust communities or ecosystem, because I think that's what really matters more than just the language itself. I don't keep in touch with that community near as much. So it's a good question, James. If anyone else in chat has an opinion on that about Rust for the cloud, I would say, yeah. I mean, Rust, I would hope, is better prepared for the cloud since it's more modern language than maybe C or whatever. So Swarmgate has to do with Stargate. Yeah. 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 When we talk about it, I'm going to suggest a name change. Swarmgate. Unless you just want to go for the drama, maybe. Is there our service that has a free Kubernetes tier? I don't think so. Yeah, by the way, Martin's saying Rust is great for WebAssembly, which you can now run in the cloud due to cloud native WebAssembly. So it's not as easy as just running Rust, but if you wanted to look into WebAssembly as your artifact type. Oh, Conrad's thrown in some knowledge on Rust. All right. Let's make sure we've covered all my tips. Don't want to waste anybody's time here. All right, we've definitely covered the Docker SSH. So 2 companies that I'm tracking. If you just want to build all your images on the fastest machine possible, regardless of whether you build local or remote, you should look at cloud builders. And what I specifically mean is until recently, until 2 years ago, the way we built containers was either locally or usually through CI, or if you set up special machines that had Docker installed on them, and then you use Docker SSH or Docker TCP, and you set up some sort of way for your CI or your local machines to run Docker build commands that were actually pointing at different endpoints, right? There's a lot of setup and customization. And I don't feel like that ever really took off until the last 2 years when depot.dev was first, and they were on this show, and then Docker both came out with what we're calling now cloud builders. And I'm going to call it cloud builders. And it's basically a way for you locally and in CI, because this works in both ways, to set a dedicated set of machines that will both build on really beefy machines. We're talking machines that are like 32 gig of RAM and 16 CPUs, stuff like that have the latest version of Docker and BuildKit. And you can actually use them in teams, and that they will cache your image builds so that they're even faster and faster each time, regardless of which machine you're using. So they're caching your cache, and they're providing the ability for your team members, to use that same cache. So think of it as like a central build cache. Now, we've had that in a lot of CI solutions for many, many years now, but it was really reserved for CI. And technically, you as the user, as your local machine, you could probably do that. But it was a lot of setup. You had to customize your Docker install. You had to know what you were doing with SSH. You had to know how to configure the remote at CI machine. And you might get in trouble if you're stealing CI resources from your team to build your local images. Well, we've now got these two cloud services. So my general advice is if you are already paying for your Docker subscription, you might consider Docker's build cloud, because they try to make that seamless to use that as a part of your Docker subscription along with your Docker Hub team members, right? So you have all those authentications already. But if you're not doing that, you would probably consider Depot, because that is the one that works everywhere. And they have very similar features, and I've been playing with them lately. So both of these tools. So with Docker, you would actually use Docker Desktop and Docker's Hub's website, which they actually have a cloud website now. You would use those to configure all this up. You would do it sort of per project, and then you enable it for your whole team, and then you would just start building. And everything is pointing your context to these remote builders. With Depot, it's a little bit different. Depot, they have a separate command line that you can just swap out. So instead of Docker build, you would do Depot build. And the same effect would happen. You would essentially use their machines. And if you didn't understand how all this works, there's a different Docker context. So the Docker project context. So whenever you do a Docker build command, and many people for years don't realize this, but when you do a Docker build and you put that dot there, that is telling the Docker build that the current directory and all of its subdirectories are the context for which you will build the software in that Docker file. So it's going to basically tarball all that up, the current directory or whatever directory you give that command and everything below it, and it will send it to wherever the engine is that you're pointed to. So this is, if you look at the -- help, you will probably see right here, the path, right? That's what we're talking about. That's the path. We used to call it the build context, but now that context word's overloaded because we have build context and CLI context, I guess you could argue they're the two different things that are kind of related, because your Docker CLI context is where your Docker build context will send all your files. And a lot of people don't realize this, that what is actually happening in the background with a build is Docker's tarballing all that off in the CLI, sending it over to where the engine is, wherever that engine is, however you're connecting, whether it's over SSH or TCP or file socket. And then that engine extracts all that stuff into a temporary location and then starts following the commands in that Docker file one by one. And if you get to a run command or a copy command, if you get to a run command, it's going to create in the background a container to run that command using a standard shell. And then it takes the changes, or it technically does like a Docker commit. If you've looked into that, it'll do a Docker commit into another image layer, and it keeps going layer by layer. And then when it's all done, it stores that in that Docker engine's image build storage location, cache, and not wherever your Docker CLI exists, right? Because that's, again, you can technically, on your Mac, never install Docker Desktop. You can even use Brew. Just install the Docker CLI, single binary, and you can manage a fleet of servers remotely with that single binary on your local machine, as long as you configure all the contexts or you change the Docker host environment variable. But yeah, that Docker context on the build, I didn't understand it for years. I didn't understand how all this was working. So it took me a while to figure out that it was pushing stuff remote. And there's even a flag. I think there's a flag there for enabling compression, which will slow down, because you'll have to compress it here and then uncompress it on the server. It'll slow that down. But if you have slow internet connection, that will speed up potentially the whole thing, because if you have 5 gigs worth of files that have to be sent to the Docker build, but if you compress it all down because it's source code, I mean, text is really compressed as well. So if it compressed all that down to less than a gig, it might be better for you to enable that. And I don't even remember, because they put that feature out. Yeah, see, it's not there. Yeah, you'd think it'd be there. I'm pretty sure there's something there. Someone probably is like, yeah, this is how you do it. Build on. I don't know. I don't remember where that is. I'm going to have to look that up. Anyway, somebody remembers. There's a flag enables compression in builds for the context transfer. I don't remember what that is. All right, check it out with chat. Check in on the chat. So Conrad's given a shout out to OrbStack because he says it's wicked fast for local Kubernetes. I can use Metal LB and K8's Gateway API on Mac OS. Cool. I'm gonna have to check it out. I mean, I've tried out OrbStack. I have not specifically tried out Kubernetes with the Gateway API on OrbStack. That with Metal LB. That sounds pretty slick. Good tip. Thanks for that. What Docker desktop replacement are folks using on Mac nowadays? I've been using Colima and I like it so far. Yeah, Colima. If you're happy with that, great. I live in a world where everybody uses Docker desktop. I would say everybody, meaning 98% of people use Docker desktop. Because they really just want things to work and be out of their way, and they're not obsessed with containers, honestly, because they're maybe not Docker captains or Docker full-time Docker engineers. They're just developers trying to get their work done. But I would say if I had to just guess percentages, okay, let's say in my worldview, it's like 90% Docker desktop. A few percentages of Rancher desktop, a few percentages of let's say Nerd Control, Colima, Finch. I don't know if you've looked at Finch, but Finch is kind of a way. Started with Mac. I think they've launched the Windows version, but Finch is AWS's sort of installation packager for getting Nerd Control, Colima, all those things. Build kit, Containerd, getting all that set up. Where before you maybe had to manage a couple of things when you were doing pure open source tooling like that, right? Without a GUI, and you just wanted the simplest setup. Basically, what we're talking about, and this is all in my I have a spreadsheet called DD Alt. I'll just pass this in the chat. Let's go look at it. So I have a spreadsheet where I try to keep track of Docker local container runtime tooling. So I'm trying to make it as agnostic as possible. This is a spreadsheet for understanding your options for running containers on your local machine for development and test, right? This isn't about production tooling. This isn't about remote tooling. This isn't about code editors. Although those things are all kind of affected. And this is my poor attempt. I say poor because I don't test each one of these tools. I depend on others. I know a few of them, mostly Docker Desktop, because that's the one I use every day. We just had one of the Finch maintainers on the show, my friend Phil Estes was on the show talking about Finch this year. And Finch is that package manager that kind of tries to just make it easier if you need to use pure open source tooling. And from AWS's point of view, they were saying that they created this project so that you could use all the tooling they use to run your containers on their platform, which that's makes sense as a marketing statement. They didn't want to create their own open source or proprietary UI or anything local tooling. And obviously they work with Docker Desktop, Rancher Desktop, Podman. They work with all that stuff, right? In terms of OCI containers are OCI containers. That's why OCI is a thing, and we love it. But Finch is an open source tool for local container development. Finch aims to help promote innovative upstream container projects, including Lima, Nerd Control, Containerd, and BuildKit, by making it easy to install and use them. Oh, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it uses Colima only. I'm trying to remember if Colima is cross-platform. But But over here, you can kind of find like the difference between all these tools. And what I've tried to do, oh, that's the wrong link. What I've tried to do is help give you, so Mac OS and Linux with minimal setup, right? So some of these tools are complementary and not competitive, and a lot of these tools you can all have. I have a lot of these tools all installed locally, so I don't actually know any of them at this point that actually conflict with each other, unless you're using something that creates like a VirtualBox machine or something like that. Because in the past, we've had, especially on Windows, like Hyper-V versus VirtualBox. Like there's fights going on in the VMs. So the whole point of this, by the way, you can make comments if you know information or if you think some information's changed. You can make comments on this spreadsheet and help me maintain it. But I've been running this spreadsheet for probably 4 years, 4 years now. And really the goal is just to help you look at some of the basic features, the common features. Obviously, look at this min resources one. And I basically give it a thumbs up, thumbs down, or in the middle, right? So the thumbs up green means yes, it does that thing. And at first, we're just talking about platforms. Which platforms do each one of these support? For example, I use K3D a lot to run right here, to run K3S inside Docker. So I prefer K3D over some of the other tools. There's MicroK, there's Minikube, there's all these other things to run Kubernetes. But when I want to run locally on my Mac, multiple Kubernetes environments, different control planes, I will use K3D. If I just want one Kubernetes control plane, I will probably default to Docker Desktop, although I'm now hearing that I should probably look at OrbStack for that. It sounds like it's got some features built in, but K3D has met my needs because it runs K3S inside a Docker container and it starts up nearly instantly, super fast. And I can shut it down by just stopping the container. So there's that. And you can, there's lots of other things in here, but I'd love any stuff you want to put there. So I try to keep everything in that list. I think most of this is actually open source. There's a few non-open source parts of Docker Desktop. I'm not sure if OrbStack is 100% open source. I feel like it's not, but I could be wrong. Someone probably knows better. But Rancher Desktop, Podman, Minikube, K3D, MicroK, KubeVirt, Golema, Finch, I think they're all 100% open source. So as I'm going to wrap up, I'm going to start wrapping this up. I'm going to answer some more of these questions, and then we're going to save some more of these tips for me to go deep into in a future live stream, like soon, like in the next couple of months. I plan on doing more Docker tip stuff because we didn't get through everything. But also the goal on these tips is to make clips, put them back on this channel so that you or others can find them quicker and just get to that little edited part of that tip. Maybe I'll make a series on that. Who knows? No promises. We'll see. Anton's asking, by the way, what is your favorite self-hosted CI/CD solution? Self-hosted, honestly, you didn't ask open source. Self-hosted, still GitHub Enterprise. I'm 100% in the GitHub ecosystem. I understand those are others. I actually have a GitLab baseball cap that I was wearing just a couple days ago. But I try, because everything else in my world view is on GitHub, I just try to live there. I feel it's the simplest for me. And the clients I work with, if they're not satisfied with GitHub Cloud, we use GitHub Enterprise because it has all of the same features, 99% of all the features, including code spaces, but privately in your data center. So GitLab, I would say there's definitely a good percentage of people, single digits probably, of my audience that use and prefer GitLab, particularly for DevOps stuff. I also have other people that hate GitLab DevOps. So I just don't have enough GitLab current experience with all the latest features in the last couple of years to really give an honest review of it. Azure DevOps, I've never self-hosted Azure DevOps, so I don't even know what that does. Someone else would have to demo that for me, and I haven't had anyone on the show to do that. But thanks, R2D2, by the way, for that question earlier about Docker desktop alternatives. That was a great question. Nuno's throwing in his knowledge about Colima Finch. That's cool. Adding WSO2 as a provider to Lima. That's cool. Yeah. This Excel file from your Docker course. Yeah, I think I threw that in at some point because the reality is not everyone can use Docker Desktop forever. Now, in my courses, I teach based on Docker Desktop. I mean, it's a Docker course, so I feel like the premium experience I feel like Docker Desktop has the most wide-ranging level of tools built in and functionality built in. Doesn't mean that your company is going to make that their official choice. But for learning, Docker Desktop has a 100% learning license. So everyone that's taking my courses, when they're learning stuff, if they're not using it for implementing in work projects, it's always free. For work projects, it does depend on the size of your company and whatnot, depending on whether it's free or not. So there's parts of Docker Desktop that are not open source. I think all the rest of these, most of these at least, are open source. So I put that in my courses because I didn't know if everyone was going to be able to use Docker Desktop day to day, and they probably would need to make a different decision. The reality is that since there's so many choices now, and I don't test them all the time, I'm not constantly wanting people to switch because I honestly think at the end of the day, only switch if you have problems. Like if you have limitations that you're frustrated with, then go look at all these other tools. But I don't expect anyone to know the top 6 Docker runtime local tools for containers. Like, I tend to see people, they get one, they like it, they stick with it, and they don't keep changing to the other ones. But hey, if that's what you like to do, that's your jam. I appreciate your advice. Like all these comments on which one you prefer, that really helps me understand what videos I need to make and what ones I might need to add actual videos to the course for, because a lot of people are using it. I just don't get people coming out of the course telling me that they've switched to something other than Docker Desktop very often. So, but when I do, that tends to be Rancher Desktop, increasingly Orb Stack, and then for Kubernetes, it's everything from Kind to Minikube to K3D to MicroK8s. It just kind of depends on their OS and their preference. This is Brett's channel, and I do love DD. Yeah, no shame on any of them. Like, I mean, I don't give anyone a hard time for which tool they want to use. If they think that's the best for them, I mean, who am I to question? It's your job. I don't know your job. So, yeah, thanks, Conrad, for the vote of confidence on the GitHub action templates. Right, okay, OrbStack isn't open source as far as I mean, it's quite honestly, it's amazing how much that person, I mean, it's largely, the last I checked, was largely built by a college student. I'm sure there's a lot more people now, but it's amazing that how much that tool can use and do, built by a relatively small team compared to the Docker team. So, all right, people. Looks like I've answered all the questions. So, coming up, we've got more guests coming. We're actually booking some guests for the next couple of months, so I will give you dates as those dates happen. Remember, like and subscribe. Like and subscribe to all my stuff. YouTube doesn't like us right now. There's not a lot of people watching the live streams as much this last year. I mean, there's literally like it fell off a cliff. So YouTube just doesn't like Docker content or my content right now. I guess there's a storm overhead because that was some lightning. But I'm coming back with some more tips in the future, and we've got more stuff coming around developer tooling. We've got some container stuff planned for future dates. So, and I think Nirmal's back next week. So come join us on Thursdays, as always, and then you can enjoy this stuff on your favorite podcast player or YouTube clips. And we're doing more of those clips this year. So check that shit out. See you soon, everybody. Ciao.